On episode 2, we are talking with Dr. Toni Watt to understand mental illness, treatment options, and how we can be a help to others. I want to start by welcoming Dr. Toni Watt. How are you today?
I'm fine. How are you?
I'm good. Could you tell our audience a little bit about who you are and your experience in dealing with mental health?
Sure. I'm a professor of sociology at Texas State University. I teach classes on mental health. One of them is called Mind and Society. And I also teach classes on substance use, a class called Drugs and Society. I also spent over 20 years studying mental health and mental illness and addiction, specifically looking towards community treatments and how to improve outcomes for people who suffer from mental illnesses and substance use disorders.
My goal is to understand the efficacy of mental health courts as an alternative for the incarceration of the mentally ill. But first, it's important to understand what causes mental illness. So Dr. Watt begins to explain that.
As you can imagine, there is no one simple explanation for why people develop mental health disorders or substance use disorders. It's complicated. But fortunately, in the last few decades, we have learned a lot. Research has told us a lot about the causes of mental illnesses and maybe how to best treat them. There are three fields that have contributed the most to our understanding: biology, psychology, and sociology. As you know, biology focuses on the body. Psychology focuses on the mind or the thought processes, and sociology focuses on the environment and the influences of the environment. Now, ideally, we would use a model that combines these three disciplines into something called the biopsychosocial model, so we could have a really comprehensive understanding of why people develop mental health disorders. Unfortunately, in the last few years, we've had a very narrow view of mental illness that has been focused primarily on biology. And we refer to that as the biomedical model. And it's not that it's bad to talk about biology, it's just it's not thorough in that model kind of doesn't involve what we've learned from the other disciplines as well. Mm-hmm. So the biomedical model focuses again on the body. And that's why many people who have mental health disorders or who might go in for treatment often are given the explanation that mental illness is a chemical imbalance in the brain. And you've probably heard this. I think many people will recognize and say, yeah, I have heard that before. And that's because it's one of the most common explanations for why people develop mental illness. And then in turn, that influences the treatment that is offered, which the most common form of treatment in this country is psychotropic medication to try to impact those neurotransmitters in the brain. And we do know that it is not only the most common form of treatment, but that other forms of treatment like counseling have been declining in recent years. This chemical imbalance theory of the brain is at best incomplete and at worst slightly inaccurate in the sense that it really oversimplifies what's happening. Now, that's not to say that biology doesn't matter. Biology does matter. We know that people may have genetic predispositions for some of these disorders. It may have been your mother, your father, your grandparents that had this disorder, and you may actually have a propensity or genetic predisposition to have schizophrenia or depression or anxiety. But what we're learning from a new field called epigenetics is that you often need an environmental stressor to activate that gene. So it's the interaction between the gene and the environment that contributes to the development of mental illness. And so biology is important, but it's less than half of this story. Mm-hmm. The other half is the environment. And unfortunately, we don't talk about that very much, and we don't include it in the treatment protocols very much. And we refer to that problem as decontextualization, which just means that we're trying to understand mental illness without understanding the context or the environment in which it emerges. Mm-hmm. So if we want to look at the environment and the factors or the environmental factors that could contribute to mental illness, we have to start first with childhood. One of the biggest predictors of mental health disorders and substance use disorders is childhood trauma. So we've learned that when children experience things like abuse, neglect, exposure to domestic violence, or have parents with significant problems like severe mental illness or addiction, or parents who are incarcerated, that all of these are really significant stressors for children. And that if you have enough of them, the level of stress can become what we call toxic. It actually begins to disrupt the body and the brain. And so the way that it does that is when you have a child that has all of this stress, their cortisol gets put on high, and cortisol is kind of what activates the fight or flight mechanism. We need it. From an evolutionary biology perspective, we need cortisol. If a lion is chasing us, we've got to be able to run. Yeah. And we don't want to have complex thoughts. We just want to run. Mm-hmm. And so it serves a purpose. But if the lion is in your house every day, if that cortisol is on every day, then it produces this toxic stress in the body because it's just on overdrive. Your fight or flight mechanism gets turned on and it gets stuck there. What that does is it can create inflammation in the body. And we know that inflammation in the body can contribute to depression, anxiety, can trigger other kinds of disorders. We also know that it creates a state of hypervigilance where children are always sort of looking for the threat. When children are looking for threat, they can't concentrate, they can't learn in school, they have trouble with trust, that those frontal lobe activities stop because the base fight or flight is always on. And so that creates problems. Then when people get in adulthood, many times they have a continuation of that stress, chronic poverty, discrimination, relationship or neighborhood violence, and then the whole thing just keeps going. Mm-hmm. And so then people often develop mental illnesses, or they turn to drugs or alcohol to try to calm those stress responses. And then all of those things can in and of themselves lead people to become incarcerated, or can contribute to other kinds of problems that lead to incarceration. Mm-hmm. And so this is sort of how all that happens. So if we want to understand why someone might find themselves in jail with a substance use disorder, we can't just talk about defective brains or defective brain chemistry. Mm-hmm. We have to start asking questions, not the question, what's wrong with you, but the question, what happened to you? And then we can begin to untangle why they're there and what to do about it.
As you can see, there's not one cause to the development of a mental illness or substance abuse disorder, which is why decontextualization can be so harmful. Understanding mental illness and substance abuse without considering the environment in which it emerges, it's a combination, biology, psychology, and environment, and it's different for each individual. Dr. Watt gave a great example of Rat Park. It was a study conducted by Canadian psychologist Dr. Bruce Alexander. And this study just really showed the importance of freedom and social interaction in maintaining good mental health and overcoming addiction.
Pretty much defined addiction as a biological process. Mm-hmm. And we get those ideas from rat studies. Rat studies that were done years and years ago did things like put a rat in a cage and they would give the rats 2 water bottles. One just had water and one had water laced with a drug like cocaine or heroin. Mm-hmm. And then they observed the rats over time. Over time, the rats would begin to use the water with the drug in it. They would use it compulsively. They would get addicted. They would get sicker and sicker and sicker. And for example, in the cage with the water and cocaine, the rats would eventually all die within 30 days. So this is where we developed this idea that drug addiction was just sort of this biological thing that was inevitable. Mm-hmm. Now, there was a researcher at the same time named Alexander who looked at that experiment and thought, there's something about this is not right. And he said, first of all, rats are social creatures, just like humans. And what you did is you put a rat alone in a cage, and then you wanted to see how it would act. That's not a natural situation. So he created a big cage and he called it Rat Park. And in Rat Park, he had all kinds of things that a rat community would want to have. It had little balls and little tunnels and lots of rat food. And there were lots of other rats that they could be friends with or have rat sex with or whatever they wanted to do. And it was the way rats were supposed to live, with lots of support and enriching experiences. And you know what they found? They put the water bottles in with the drugs The rats would try the drug, but they didn't keep using it. They didn't use it compulsively, they didn't get addicted, and they didn't die. And so Alexander's conclusion was, when we think about addiction, his central conclusion was, it's not the chemical, it's the cage.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think this is kind of what we want to talk about here when we want to understand what's going on with people. Is it just a biological deficiency in their chemicals, or is it their cage? Is it their community? Is it their environment? And I think that's what we have to start asking ourselves if we want to help people heal. And literally, what do we do sometimes when people have mental illness or addiction? We literally put them in cages.
Yeah.
And that's that's what your podcast is about today, right? Is that the best solution? And what is an alternative to that?
Yes, exactly. That is a perfect segue into our next question. I really liked when you said what happened to you rather than what's wrong with you, because I think that is a big question to think about when you talked about the decontextualization and figuring out like the environment, since that plays such a big factor, especially like you said, that we are social creatures. But knowing that these are different for different people in different socioeconomic statuses and just all that plays into it. Are there any ethnic or racial groups that may be more likely to have mental illness?
Sure. That's also a complicated question in the sense that researchers have looked to see if there are racial or ethnic differences in the incidence of mental health and mental illness and substance abuse. And it's a little complicated by the fact of underreporting, underdiagnosis, and all of these kinds of things. And basically, though, what I would say is that when racial or ethnic groups experience stressors at a higher rate than the general population, which they do, most of them do, then yes, you are going to see a greater propensity or risk factors for mental illnesses and severe addictions because, for example, African Americans and Hispanics have 3 times the rate of poverty. We know that these populations experience discrimination, and there have been studies that actually show how not even just experiencing discrimination, but just anticipating discrimination, thinking it's going to happen, can raise that cortisol in your body. So we know that when you live in a society that treats people unequally, as we do, that there's going to be disproportionate stress on those populations that can contribute to the problems that we're talking about. On the other hand, we also know that there are things called protective factors. And many racial or ethnic groups have protective factors of family and community support that are really strong. And so that's why it's hard to just say yes or no. But those things all matter, that when people in those groups have the stressors and not the supports, then absolutely you're going to see higher rates. And then when you add on top of that, that they are disproportionately policed for some of these problems, the rate of drug use, just drug use in the society, is very similar for, say, whites and African Americans. But instead, we know that African Americans are more likely to be arrested, prosecuted, convicted, and receive longer sentences for substance abuse than whites. And so that's why you will see them overrepresented in the criminal justice system, not because they have higher use rates, but because of these disproportionalities.
Environment, race, ethnicity, levels of support, resources, all these things and more make up our cage. But no matter our cage, there's always room for recovery, which begs the question, is medication necessary? Can it help alone? Or are there other options? Is it necessary to begin with? These are the questions that we dive into next.
Healing is possible. We've learned a lot about something called neuroplasticity. The brain can heal from trauma. The brain constantly can continue to change and grow in different ways, and that there are a lot of things that can help with healing. And it used to be, especially even with serious mental illnesses like schizophrenia, that our thought was this was just a defect and it was a lifelong disorder and it was an identity. And we're learning now, not necessarily, that even people with disorders like schizophrenia can heal and have very, very healthy and happy lives and have positive mental health as well. And so recovery is definitely possible. And I think that's a really important message to get out there. Now, with regard to medication, there are a lot of controversies around it. Some people feel very strongly about the value. Some people feel very strongly against it. And we haven't resolved that debate. But the one thing that is not controversial, that is not debatable, is the fact that medication only suppresses symptoms. It does not heal. And if you think about it, like if you get a fever, because say you have the flu, you can take Tylenol or you can take something to bring your fever down, but you still have the flu. And when it wears off, the fever comes back, you're still sick. That medication didn't do anything to make you well. And this is what we know about medication is for some people, they really, really need to suppress those symptoms. But there are other things that can sometimes do it and do it more effectively because it's healing instead of just suppressing symptoms. And so there are a lot of choices in that regard. Mm-hmm. One of them is counseling. Mm-hmm. There have been hundreds of studies that counseling is an effective way to significantly improve mental health, particularly if it's trauma-informed or trauma-based therapies, because a lot of that gets at the root of the problem. Yeah. Whereas if you just suppress symptoms, you're not getting at the root cause of anything. Mm-hmm. And so counseling and the right type of counseling is a really effective thing for people to do. And I hope that people will consider it. And there are also a lot of other things that don't cost any money at all. I know a lot of people might not have insurance for counseling. And we also know that treatments like medication also have significant side effects typically, but there are a whole range of choices or tools in your toolbox, as I say, that you can use to try to improve mental health. And there's no one thing that just works. You just want to try as many of them as you can. Yeah. And so exercise is significantly related to improvements in mental health, or a lack of exercise can sort of exacerbate problems. Diet is significantly related to mental health. We're learning a lot about gut bacteria and mental health and mental illness. So you got to eat that yogurt. You got to eat fruits and vegetables. If you eat a lot of processed foods, you're going to have a lot higher risk of mental health disorders. And so exercise, diet are really great things. We know yoga even has more benefits than just exercise alone. We know that meditation actually can change that fight or flight mechanism in the brain, and actually can heal the brain that may be on overdrive, and that costs nothing. There are great meditation apps. Yeah. And finally, believe it or not, nature is very healing. Many people have talked about forest bathing. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but in Japan, they had an entire national health campaign to get people out in nature. And they do what's called forest bathing. They go in the forest and walk around. You don't have to work out. You just walk around nature and trees and in green spaces. And they found that only 1 hour in nature significantly improved blood pressure, inflammation, reduced that cortisol, improved mental health. And that 1 hour in nature could actually improve mental health an entire month. So this is not about just hugging a tree or oversimplifying, just walking around, and now you'll feel better. There's evidence. They spent $1 million on the evaluation of forest bathing, and it works. So we have lots of things, and we just need to educate the public about all of their choices for improving their mental health.
Yes, that's great. I think education is so important. Just learning what our options are, what we have, and what's available for people to use. And with that, so if someone is suffering from mental health issues or has a mental illness and they are seeking out treatment options, or if they're going out in nature, trying to do right by their diet and exercise, what could be some drawbacks if they're pulled out of this environment, this routine that they've created for themselves, and it's interrupted if they get incarcerated or if something else happens?
Exactly. It goes back to Rat Park, right? Which is if you're put in a cell where you don't feel safe, you don't feel any social support, you have very little exercise, you have a terrible diet, right? You're not getting a lot of sunshine in nature. I mean, we even know vitamin D affects mental health. And so you just take away all those things and then you add a lot of stress, and that can be really, really re-traumatizing or traumatic for people. And it definitely is not conducive to mental health. And again, if some people are on medication, One of the things you should never do is abruptly stop your medication. If you do end up going off medication, it has to be a really slow tapered process. And there are actually books about how to do it. And doctors can sort of help people understand how to do it. But sometimes those people are just incarcerated and abruptly taken off their medication, put in this traumatic situation. And that can really, really be devastating.
Finally, resources. How can we help others? How can we help ourselves?
Well, I think we have to work very much on reducing stigma that surrounds mental illness and addiction. And I think part of that is to talk about the environmental stressors, because when you just define these problems as just biological defects in your brain, you're really telling people you're different, you're damaged. And it implies that you're damaged and you're permanently damaged. And that's a scary thing for people, you know? But when we realize that very often, many of us will go through periods in our life where we experience depression or anxiety, depending on the circumstances we're in or what we've been through, that this is part of the human condition. And that these are also things that people can recover from and get through, and that help is available. So you do want to have a recovery orientation when you talk to people about the potential for, if you're struggling, well, you can heal. And here are the things that can help you heal. And there are resources out there for you. And to begin to help people navigate and find those resources, there are hotline numbers, there are suicide hotline numbers, there are substance use hotline numbers. There are also, like at Texas State, there's the counseling center, and there are also online resources with the counseling center. There are other organizations like National Alliance for Mental Illness, Mental Health America, the Hogg Foundation. They all have websites that have tons of information about mental health and can also sort of help people find counselors or resources to help them. And I'm going to give you a document at the end of our interview so that maybe you can share some of those websites and phone numbers with your listeners.
Yes, I will definitely do that. Thank you so much, Dr. Watt, for your time today and for just all of the information that you've given us about the causes of mental health and treatment options, medications, and how we can help people with resources. It's all been very wonderful. We greatly appreciate it.
Well, thank you. And thank you for doing your podcast on such an important subject.
Thank you.